Hey guys, this is going to be a quick review on chapter 23 about World War One. If you guys remember, that chapter covered sort of the lead up to World War One, World War One itself, and then the immediate aftermath. So I'm not going to cover every single detail because we've already done that, but it's been a while, so I wanted to give you the most important things again. Please feel free to submit any questions you have at the end of this. Email is the best way to do that. I want to start off by reminding everyone, before World War One, the United States had already been very much involved in other parts of the world. So the main story with World War One is isolationism. The United States was minded its own business. It didn't want to be involved, and it did not want to be part of that war. It saw it as a European problem. Let them handle it. And that is definitely true. However, sometimes the way that people think about it, it can also have some misleading elements. What I mean is that the United States, with respect to the big imperialist powers of Europe, German Empire, the United Kingdom, France, the United States did not get involved in European disputes. The United States sort of saw its role in the world as opening things up for American businesses. So there would be obvious interaction. We talked about the open door policy in China. We talked about the Boxer Rebellion, which is an extension of that. We talked about the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is about aggressively not only limiting European influence in the Western Hemisphere, Central, South America, but also making the United States really in charge of domestic politics in Central and South America. Monroe originally planned on trying to just limit European influence, and then during the age of imperialism, Roosevelt sort of used that and expanded it well beyond its original intention to basically make it official that the United States was going to take over governments in the Western Hemisphere that could not pay their bills, or that had some sort of political instability, depending on the situation. So anyway, but just remember that the United States was absolutely active on the international level. So it really wasn't like a hermit just coming out of the cave for the first time in World War One. So a term that we use for that whole era, when the United States becomes involved in the rest of the world before World War One, progressive diplomacy is a term that gets used there. The interesting thing about progressive diplomacy, we've learned about progressivism, the progressive era, and the quickest association people have with that is domestic politics or domestic policy. So, we talked about how industrialization brought a whole lot of problems that the United States had never experienced before, and the progressive era was really about solving a lot of those problems. When it came to solving those problems, the answers typically always went to more powerful government, more regulation, and we've already talked about how that didn't necessarily lead to large, giant corporations having less power. It just meant that, there were tweaks here and there that eased the suffering of the average worker, that put a little bit more money in the pocket of the average worker, and so standard of living went up. So anyway, again, trying not to get lost in that, progressivism is typically associated with reform in the United States to make the average person better off, to try to make the world, or the American world, a better place for the average American, based on morality and all those other things we talked about. So why mention that? Well, progressive diplomacy is very different. Whenever we talk about progressive diplomacy, we're talking about the attitude that Americans had, or at least the American government had, on foreigners, which is very different than, on Americans. So at the very same time that the United States was making reforms to make, the situation better for the average worker, it was aggressively expanding its interventionism around the world. And so early in American history, diplomacy, like founding fathers early in American history, diplomacy was seen as a way for the United States to protect its own freedoms at home by limiting the encroachment of the European monarchies and oligarchies. Again, we're talking early 1800s, late 1700s, and that was the Monroe Doctrine. So the idea of colonialism or imperialism obviously went very, very much against the revolutionary American spirit. Of course, as the United States grew, as industrialism and capitalism set in, the United States became more economically connected to the rest of the world. Many Americans began to believe that, that more thorough relationship with the rest of the world, like I just talked about, that was not only a good idea, but maybe even necessary. And so Americans began to believe that not only should the United States be more involved, but they also were developing reasons why it was a good thing that the United States was involved, and not just a good thing for Americans, because that's easy, but a good thing for the whole world. And so the morality that is, or the ideas about morality that were involved in the progressive era at home were, I would say, awkwardly applied to how the United States should treat other people around the world. American morals, American ideals, let's export those. Of course, this idea that the American way was good for everyone is, of course, paternalistic. And if you don't know what that means, if you've ever heard someone's patronizing you, sort of like talking to you like you're inferior, well, that's exactly the sort of attitude that the United States is going to have at this point, that whether it be forcing another part of the world or pressuring another part of the world, or just enticing another part of the world to have a closer relationship with the United States, to be more like Americans, to culturally, religiously, all sorts of ways. So anyway, this is the beginning of the concept of American exceptionalism. So American exceptionalism definitely existed before World War I. And if you guys remember, we talked about manifest destiny, moving out west, taking land, expanding the United States all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, filling up the borders at the expense of Native Americans. Now that that was done, the borders were filled out. Expansion had become a huge part of the American value system, continuing to grow, continuing to export. And so once Native Americans had been totally dispossessed, it was the turn of much of the rest of the world. And so now that Manifest Destiny was finished on the continent, the expanding, modernizing industrial American spirit needed a new wilderness, and that's going to be the rest of the world. We talked about the United States and the Caribbean. We talked about the whole Panama episode. I'm not going to get back into that, but just remember that, we talked about all the different examples of the United States and the Caribbean. I mean, there's over a dozen examples of the United States, unilaterally, most of the time, intervening with domestic politics of some of these countries in the Western Hemisphere, and it always results in a situation that's better for American businesses. So, and again, that was not just Roosevelt, but you're talking Taft. It was the whole era known as the imperialism, which still goes on now, just different flavor. Another part of this chapter was the whole comparison of dollar diplomacy and moral diplomacy. Again, this is all before World War I. Dollar diplomacy was very similar to moral diplomacy. It was basically about using the American dollar, American businesses, American banks to invest in the recovery of failing states or other struggling countries. And by doing that, the United States businesses and banks gain leverage and then are able to eventually get involved or become very influential in politics in these other countries in the Western Hemisphere, and use political leverage to make it even easier for American businesses to dominate those local economies. Now, Woodrow Wilson, who was, I think, believed a lot in his own morals, and I think believed that they always guided his decisions, he wanted to have the best of both worlds. He thought that, hey, we can get these benefits for American companies, but we can also do so in a way that's consistent with our values. So that's where moral diplomacy comes from. And basically, his system, if you're going to make a decision based on morals, an important thing to do is understand what are your morals, because not everyone has the same morals. Not everyone believes in the same specific right and wrong. There's some things that cut across cultures, but there's a lot of specifics that do not. So when we talk about Woodrow Wilson's system of beliefs, We're talking about a belief in justice, which is a vague concept, but democracy, very big, still used a lot in modern American values, and then other, specific Judeo-Christian values. So anyway, Wilson didn't like dollar diplomacy. He believed that it favored narrow interests of particular companies and frequently supported unconstitutional regimes. The key phrase there is unconstitutional regimes. Wilson thought that the United States should only do business with people or with countries that had values consistent with American values. So whether it's a constitutional republic, a democracy, whatever you want to call it, Wilson was very much pro-intervention, but wanted to pick and choose the good guys, which we've talked about several times. The United States is not good at choosing good guys. It tends to find out that whether or not there, are good guys in a certain civil war or revolution. It's even debatable whether or not there is a good side. It's just different sides a lot of times. Anyway, you can draw your own conclusions there. But one big thing, we talked about the horror show that was the Philippine insurrection, during the Spanish-American War, or after the Spanish-American War, whenever Filipinos wanted independence from Americans and the United States said no. And it was a very brutal war that involved a lot of war crimes, a lot of civilians being murdered, soldiers, POWs being tortured on both sides. Anyway, he pushed for more Philippine independence. He wanted the Philippines to have more independence. He saw it as a stain on American history, and, he wouldn't say that because that's not very presidential, but anyway, he pushed for that. And then the other big thing is we covered that intervention in Mexico. So I'm not going to give you the details. Your book goes into all the details you need, but don't forget, intervention in Mexico is an example of Wilson's moral diplomacy, and it's a very clear example on why the United States, getting involved in situations that it barely understands, trying to pick who is the good guy, who's the bad guy here, made the situation from every perspective much, much worse. So remember, get back into your notes on that. And so now I'm going to finally jump into World War I. You guys remember we spent a lot of time on the crazy situation of how an assassination in Sarajevo, off to the southeast of Europe, eventually led to the most destructive war in human history at that point. I'm not going to get into all those specifics again because, I don't think there's a main point that asks you that directly. If I have questions on that, I'll answer them. But the biggest thing that we're going to cover, or I'm going to cover again here, is the American attitude. And so most Americans were shocked by the war. Most Americans knew next to nothing about Serbia. That's the country that was involved in the controversy over the death or the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and most Americans didn't really care. Most Americans interpreted this World War I. Most Americans saw it as a European problem, that the United States had no business getting involved. And we talked about, that doesn't mean that Americans didn't care who won. There were different opinions. The overwhelming majority of Americans sided emotionally with Great Britain and France. But, it wasn't as cut and dry. Another thing I tried to do is remember, the whole Nazi thing, that is not World War I. That was World War II. World War I was the German Empire. Hitler was not the leader. Hitler was a soldier. The big thing here, though, is American neutrality. And we talked about how, there's different shades of neutrality. Meaning that, if you're purely neutral, you're not only not officially fighting on one side, but you're not doing anything for one side that you're not doing for the other. And the United States was never purely neutral. It was so we can say that Wilson's stance on neutrality was inconsistent. So American policies, whether we're talking about economic aid, like loans, things like that, obviously are going to favor the Entente powers. And remember, the Entente is that French word, Russia, France, Britain, particularly Britain. The United States had a really close relationship with Britain. The way that we sort of set up the United States entering World War I, if you guys remember, we talked about all the different factors involved. Now, the standard story is the Lusitania, the British cruise liner that was sunk by the Germans, and 128 Americans died, and that's what does the big thing that caused the United States to get involved in the war. If you guys remember, we covered it, it was around a year after that event that the United States got involved in the war. So we know that it's definitely not just that. There's a lot of other things that are going on behind the scenes when it comes to American involvement in World War I. But the big story with the Lusitania, it's not irrelevant. It's definitely very important. Americans who were continuing to go on cruises, don't ask me why, to Great Britain. The more Americans that died, the more sympathy there was for the idea that the United States should get involved. Now again, Germany did not want to kill Americans, not because they especially loved Americans, but because they did not want the United States in the war. So they tried to avoid it. The thing is that in a war zone where, if you guys remember, Britain was trying to blockade Germany to starve them out, Germany was trying to counter-starve Great Britain. So that whole, the English Channel, the North Sea, basically the ocean around Britain was a war zone. And so knowing this, the British and Americans would try to smuggle supplies on civilian ships. That did happen a lot. It happened on the Lusitania. It's not a cut and dry situation. Definitely a situation where Germany wanted to avoid killing Americans. But it seemed as if the American government didn't really take a lot of steps to prevent Americans from dying. It was almost like all on Germany to figure out a way to stop sinking ships that have Americans on them. The other big things that you don't hear about nearly as much are the fact that, and we covered this, American banks were loaning out lots and lots of money to British and French companies, French government. And at a certain point of the World War I, before the United States got involved, there was a legitimate fear that France could fall. France was experienced unbelievable casualties, unbelievable destruction of its industry. The only way for banks, American banks, to get their money back is if France doesn't collapse. Good luck getting your money back if Germany takes over France. And so there's going to be a lot of lobbying from banks, from J.P. Morgan and his financial empire. There's going to be a lot of lobbying to get the United States involved. It sounds like some sort of like greedy banker conspiracy, but at the end of the day, it's a fact that banks were scared that they were not going to get their money back and that they were so leveraged that they may collapse and that could ruin the American economy. So, there's a big reason why loans and financial leverage and all that stuff went into the calculus of should the United States get involved in the war. And this helps explain why there was such a disconnect for such a long time between the American populace and the American government, and especially the lobbying that on the American government to go to war. And anyway, eventually that's going to push the United States. Oh, and then there's the Zimmerman telegram too. We talked about that. There was the new threat. Remember, in the middle of World War I, Russian Empire collapsed. That was communism, and that's another huge threat to capitalism. So there's a desire to intervene to destroy communism. So it's a lot more entangled. So go back to your notes on that. I know we covered that in great detail. If I have questions on that, I can get back into some of those details, but don't forget that. Another big thing is the American goal in the war. Typically, when a war starts, the specific or maybe technical reasons why a country gets involved in a war, those sort of melt away and become less important. Because in order to motivate a country for like a huge task, a huge sacrifice like World War I, you need good slogans. You need a good, quick, emotional, satisfying justification or like battle cry. That means that if you've learned anything about the American Revolution, how Thomas Paine's common sense, and they weren't talking about British regulatory measures and the Sugar Act as quite as much anymore. They were talking about establishing a new form of government, having a government based on consent, all these larger philosophical ideas. Well, in World War I, whenever it was time for war, Wilson, the president, Woodrow Wilson, is going to claim that the war was a war for spreading democracy, for opening global markets, for ending imperialism, which is extremely ironic, no matter what your opinion is, to end jingoism, which is an awesome word, to end militarism, so like German Empire, militarist empire. But Wilson saw the war as the only realistic way for the United States to spread its long-standing vision throughout the rest of the world. And then the next thing we covered was the horror of World War I battlefields. And the big story there is there's a rapid increase of military technology. We talked about how technology changed American society, right? We talked about how huge changes in the way people lived, from electricity to all sorts of consumer technologies that made living easier, that made people have to spend less time on chores, farming technology, all that stuff. So there's going to be new military technology as well, and it's going to radically change the battlefield. Now, the issue there is that it becomes a lot easier to kill people on a battlefield, but the strategies don't change much at all. And so you have strategies and tactics that were developed for far less deadly weapons, and are going to be, those strategies will not go away after very devastating bloody battles. Basically what's going to happen is this idea that, well, whichever side gives up first loses. And so, yes, the casualties are unbelievably high. It's almost suicide, and in some cases it is suicide to, crawl out of the trench and go fight. But the idea is like, well, as long as they give up first. And so this is where that jingoism and the nationalism becomes really deadly, because every country believes they're the best, and that they're the right, they're the good guy. Whether it's God or nature or whatever will eventually justify our sacrifice and prove that we're the good. So, people were running up against suicidal, terrible casualties, and they just kept doing it. They would not adjust until about the end. I described no man's land and trenches. We talked about the three big technological developments, or at least innovations, military, that changed things so much. And it sounds really basic: barbed wire, okay, which slowed people down, and the machine gun, and then high explosive artillery. Artillery probably being the biggest one, but those three things just led to unprecedented carnage, and the tactics just didn't even take them into account at all.